So thanks for inviting me. We had on the agenda today, sort of pre-planned, a few minutes to discuss research ethics and local institutional support. The latter of which is not going to be very specific to some people here that are attending from other institutions. But thankfully, I didn't have a whole lot planned there. REBs are they're a very common part of doing a research project, and I've always found that we are all armchair ethicists. And so I've been involved in a lot of conversations with clinical investigators, research investigators doing large and small projects. And there's always 1,001 concerns, some of them ethical, that are brought up as potential barriers, seemingly insurmountable, frustrating, etc. And I think as researchers or experienced, unexperienced, it's something that's always a part of the discussion, and there's always a lot of confusion. And so the purpose of a short bit of slides that I have is maybe to dispel and offer an opportunity for us to discuss some of these. This is sort of like a human habit, I think, of being an armchair ethicist. It's sort of like if you watch sports, I was watching Formula One over the weekend. I'm probably maybe the only one that watches Formula One. And a gentleman by the name of Lewis Hamilton won his 7th championship. And I was discussing with my, this will be brief, by the way, with my brother-in-law. And I was like, oh yeah, Lewis Hamilton, he's just so fantastic. He has great tire management, this and that. And I thought to myself, I drive a Honda Ridgeline truck. What the heck do I know about tire management? Absolutely nothing. It's not part of my daily life. I've never raced anything except for maybe a bike when I was a child. So the same is true for research ethics. A lot of people have a lot of opinions, you'll find, but they haven't experienced the gamut. So who am I to talk to you about this? I'm somebody who has read the ethical guidelines in Canada. I'm someone who have tested them successfully with research ethics boards. I've done projects large and small. I do a lot of data platform work, which gets me oftentimes in this gray area of research ethics and privacy law in Canada, as well as done initiatives that you would think maybe would require ethics, but actually don't anywhere. And I found people sort of surprised by it. What is an REB? And that's a really important thing about what is and what isn't an REB. I think there's some confusion about this, even among fairly established researchers. At least in the Canadian context, a research ethics board, or sometimes called an institutional review board, they're, in Canada anyway, around to ensure that the research that occurs within their purview, which is usually either an academic institution, let's say McMaster University, for instance, or any university, or it might be a hospital. So the research that occurs within their purview, using their resources, access to their patients, or by their individuals, either registered students or research staff or affiliated staff, that it's done according to the conduct of a research policy or a jurisdiction. In Canada, that's the Tri-Council policy statement. And it is essentially a long document. It's not quite a statement. It's much longer than that. That you could find the link there. If you're going to do enough research, it is important to read it, certainly. And so the way to think about an RAB is that it's based off of a set of rules, but it's also based off of the interpretation of those rules. And so it's sort of like the governing law for a country, in the sense that there are lawyers who test the law, and precedent is 9/10 of the law. It's the same is true for research ethics. And there isn't a lot of consistency across the country, except that with research ethics, there's very few Supreme Courts. And so your job as a researcher is to understand the law, in this case, the ethical guidelines, so as you can steer and navigate your research project in an effective way. Otherwise, you get in a bit of trouble. And some people, they're around to ensure that the content of the research the research question is broadly ethical. So they might have an issue, for instance, if you're studying a question around someone's metabolic reaction during a skydiving event, because obviously there's risk implied. And so In this case, they're ensured that the question is broadly ethical. What they don't do, they don't decide if your project is worthwhile. That's not the mandate of an ethics board in Canada under the rules. They're not around to peer review your methods, although they may ask it because they're trying to understand the ethical framework in which you're approaching your project and the specifics in order to make a decision on how ethically you're conducting your project, and also to understand your constraints and your plans. They do not exist to clear your work for publication. That is absolutely not the case. And it is an abuse of the research ethics process that any editor or journal would de facto need research ethics. In fact, some of the largest trials in some spaces have been quality improvement trials where there's been no informed consent and no formal research ethics board review because they've been quality improvement trials. They do not concern themselves with privacy law, although oftentimes under some jurisdictional law where you're using research data, you need to show research ethics approval beforehand. But they are different. If you have REB approval, it doesn't mean that you have privacy or confidentiality approval.
Andrew, are you taking any questions at this time?
Yeah, jump in. Absolutely.
Okay, so I'll hear from McMaster. It's my understanding from the Hamilton Research Board that if you're doing quality improvement work, you're absolutely entitled to go ahead and do as much QI work that you want. However, if you want to publish your results, you may still need to get an expedited or a waiver from REB just to ensure patient confidentiality and all such privacy matters. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Sunil, I'll probably take it in a second. Is that okay?
No problem. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a big thing, and so here is a nice comic where basically someone's research project has been essentially ruined from their point of view because of the IRB's suggestions. And you invite this sort of a thing to the extent that you don't understand the guiding principles of research ethics in the country and that you don't offer productive suggestions for a research ethics board to consider. And you are expected that if there's a ruling coming back that they don't accept the way you're conducting the study, that there's a back and forth of what your needs and constraints are and how to make it work. You'll find that they're much more receptive where you're making arguments based off of precedent and based off of the rules. Research and quality improvement, Sunil, great question. There obviously is a difference. So typically for institutional research ethics board, they're concerned with human participants or human research or human biological materials. And anywhere in Canada, anything involving human participants or human biological materials requires ethics approval before the research commences. That doesn't mean that anything that is scholarly or involving human participants or biological materials requires ethics. That means any research involving. And so that's based off of a very broad definition of what is research. But it's also quite clear that quality improvement or quality assurance projects do not require research ethics approval. And what are those? That is when data is collected for assessment, management, or improvement purposes. And let me get a bit more specific on that because it's a bit of a dance and it's not quite clear. In some circumstances, they could look fairly similar, and in some circumstances, they look very different. And so if you have maybe even some examples, we could discuss them. But here is some guidance that we provide to researchers at the Waterloo Regional Campus. So if the purpose of your project is designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge, and so the inferences of your study isn't speaking to your own clinical practice, your own clinic's work, your own institution, then it's speaking to a broader purpose, then that's research. And that requires approval. If your project is designed to basically be implemented or to assess a process or a program that's very constrained to a jurisdiction, usually under your or your institution's control, then that's quality improvement and you can proceed without it. It already does. Individuals, institutions, clinical practice programs, they collect data on patients. They do surveys on patients that are wholly quality improvement, do not get research ethics. And that's because it's directed not towards generalizable knowledge, but in its purpose, it's directed primarily towards internal processes. The design, if you have a rigorous protocol, if you have any kind of a protocol that remains unchanged throughout the research or involves comparisons or control groups, that is certainly research. And so if you have a document that looks like a protocol, you're doing research. Otherwise, if you have kind of a general overview around a design that is pretty unspecific, that is pretty flexible, that can change over time, then that's looking more like quality improvement. Around benefits, if the benefits are directed towards a process or a system or a program directly, that's more like quality improvement research. Risks, there's not too much that's differentiating, except that in the case of research, if it poses a risk to participants to be involved in the project, then obviously it's research. Otherwise, a lot of research doesn't pose direct risk to participants, and certainly quality improvement doesn't. If the endpoint is to improve a program, then it's quality improvement. It could be quality improvement. If it answers a specific research question, if you have a research question at all that is generalizable, or you have a hypothesis that you're testing that's generalizable, it's research. And in terms of analysis, basically, if you have an analytic plan that has anything to do with a sample size calculation, it's research versus quality improvement, where a sample size calculation is generally superfluous because you're only concerned with your own context. And so it sort of is what it is. So these are the guidelines that REB boards will use if you ask them around what qualifies as quality improvement and research. It is usually around purpose and intent, risks, and either the lack of having a specific design or not having it. I have some clarifying quizzes that we can maybe go over. You have a quality improvement project as previously defined, meaning it's specific to a program within your control, your own clinical practice, for instance, and you want to publish the results of the quality improvement project. So let's say you've newly implemented a new system of triage in your emergency department, or you're using a new technology, not experimental, and you want to publish results in terms of how people liked it, how patients liked it, etc. Do you need REB? Anybody want to hazard a guess? No. It's absolutely clear, at least in Canada, if you're publishing or disseminating the results of an activity, that is not grounds for whether or not you need REB. Publishing as a function does not require REB. You can publish even big quality improvement projects without REB review. There's all kinds of precedent for it. There may not be precedent in your particular field, given the way you do research, but in many fields, there's absolutely huge precedence. And you'll find that some editors have confusion about this, but I can assure you that it's their confusion. And obviously it's changing. You collect the data as part of a QI initiative, but now you want to use it for research. And so let's say, for instance, you establish a mechanism to, within your practice, collect information on your patient roster because you want to be able to use it to understand their health outcomes and improve your own practice. But in the process of doing that, you've discovered that you'd like to use that same information source because you have a research question associated with it, and you have a plan to use it for a research purpose. Do you need REB? Anybody want to hazard a guess? It's generally yes, but it's also a bit of a maybe. In this case, you'd want to ask. If the data are collected for QI, but later propose a research, basically what you would generally do is get approval for the secondary use of health information, which would probably require an REB review. It might be waived sometimes, depending on the nature of the question, but you would probably want to get guidance from your ethics board. You want to create a patient database. These are a little bit more specific. Your patients or your clinics under your direct control, where that might be used for QI and research. So you're creating a little bit of an internal platform. Do you need REB? The answer is probably not, but there are specifics you want to keep in mind. If you're legally entitled to have access to a set of records that you're collating and you don't have a specific purpose for it, but it's generally meant to improve care quality, that is a primarily REB QI purpose. And you generally don't need REB until such time that the data is used for research. In Canada, we collect patient data and registries, not for research purposes, but and they're subsequently, when they're used for research purposes, they're a secondary there's REB approval for secondary use of those records that's obtained. But at least the initial instance does not require ethics if you are legally entitled to have access to those records. You want to implement or evaluate a non-experimental process or procedure in your clinic with your patients. And you want some evaluation metrics on that. Does it require REB? I think we've discussed no. If it's non-experimental and it's implemented, this occurs all the time. It occurs without consent. It occurs without REB, and information can be collected on outcomes. And generally, you won't require REB to publish that because you're publishing a QI initiative. You propose to do a case report, very popular activity, on an interesting patient case in your practice. Do you require REB? You do not. In fact, in Canada and internationally as well, when you publish in a case report journal, you don't get research ethics. Case reports are considered education because they're not research in terms of them being a systematic endeavor. But they are subject to privacy and confidentiality. So in most cases, if you can obtain consent, you're legally obliged to do it. And this is true in our own case report journals we have at McMaster. So that gives you the idea of also informed consent. And so informed consent's a funny thing, and it's a bit of a slippery slope. The expectation of privacy is changing generation to generation as we put things about ourselves out there, and our data are collected without our knowledge or explicit consent by a lot of platforms. And so it's a changing conversation. But in terms of informed consent, which is the consent of patients to take part in a research or quality improvement projects, the guidelines in Canada are these. And usually you don't need informed consent. But in the case of research, you have to request a waiver as part of your application. When all the following are true, that the research involves no more than minimal risk to the participant, so it's unlikely to adversely affect the welfare of participants. And so there's no additional risk of being involved. And it's impossible or impractical to carry out the research to answer the question if prior consent was required. And so the way it is in Canada anyway is that you can't get exempt from informed consent because it's difficult. It needs to be impossible or impractical. And it needs to come at very little risk to the welfare of participants. And so many patients are part of projects that they don't know that they're a part of because of constraints or data collection procedures that essentially do not require them to change anything that they're doing in a clinical scenario, and where their identities and their confidentiality is strictly protected through measures. If you can prove that there's no additional risk and that it's improbable, then consent's not required. I'll give you the example of a project that we're doing, which is to set up a COVID registry across hospitals in our region. And the issue of informed consent came up. And we weren't required to get informed consent because the information we're collecting comes directly from the chart. And so patients aren't bothered by the process. It's done remotely. And in that case, it's actually impractical to get their consent because for the most part, we sometimes only know that they're COVID positive after they've been discharged, or some of them would die or be in a situation where we couldn't consent them, but that and so it's impossible and practical to do that. So that's a little bit on research ethics. For more information, we have a website that we host that has some information on what is quality improvement, what is research that you can access. Any thoughts or examples from the group around some challenges they've had with research ethics boards or lack of clarity around whether their projects have been quality improvement or research?
Andrew, my colleague Giacomo Consorti from Italy is attending, and we're actually working on a faculty development quantitative study. It's a survey-based study, and we had a lot of debate about what is, required for REB versus not. And your slides just answered so many of our questions because it doesn't look like the rules are universal in every part of the world. So it was a QI at MAC and a full REB review in Italy.
Yep. And even within Canada, if you'll go, we've had the situation where we've done multi-provincial, multi-jurisdictional trials, observational studies, and every REB has their own flavor. But what you'll find is that if you're arguing on the basis of, it's kind of like being a lawyer on precedent, so studies that you know that have occurred without it, sometimes that they've approved, sometimes the month prior that they're unaware of. They're like human beings and they're inconsistent like the rest of us. Or you can point to another REB that agrees with your arguments that under the governing policy of the country that you're within your limits to request something from the REB, then usually they'll come your way as long as you have an informed argument. Otherwise, you're somebody uninformed trying to, who can't argue again, for your best interest. And sometimes that can actually shift the study to the extent that it's no longer viable. And REBs don't have that intention typically. They're happy to reconsider if you have good justification.
Can I add something here, Andrew?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, Sunil Patty from McMaster. Sometimes we found it with our experiences in Niagara and previously in Hamilton that this is a scenario where sometimes it's better to ask permission than beg forgiveness after the fact for a number of reasons. Like I've had a number of QI type projects where I send a quick email to the REB administrator and they get back to me in a day saying, not a problem, go ahead and do your thing. And they tell me, please save this email for future purposes, which we download and do. And then in our manuscripts later on, we write a one-liner in our methods that this was submitted and got an exemption from REB. And that satisfies a lot of the journal editors that I think you had you made the comment earlier about the ambivalence about whether they understand what needs REB or not. But that one line is worth its weight in gold. And often the REBs are more than happy to give you an email saying that, yep, this is QI or whatever. You don't need, here's your waiver email, off you go. And that's a key document to keep in the protocol documents in my experience. I don't know what other people's experiences are with such, but
yeah, I can agree. I have an example where I was working on something before I was working in academia and I was working in government, and we had developed an algorithm to prioritize people on a wait list for going to long-term care homes. It was something that was done properly as QI, right, within the organization, within the jurisdiction, but it's something that potentially could get used by people in other jurisdictions. So there's a line of whether or not it's research, right? And then when we went to try to publish it as quality improvement, it came back from the journal saying you need to get, an REB to basically sign off and say it's that it is quality improvement and not. And, we didn't think that was necessary, but if, if the journal is going to have that requirement, you can't talk them out of it, then you're sort of stuck with it. But we didn't even know, like, for that, it's like if you're in an institution, the institution we were at wasn't like a hospital or anything. It's like there's not a REB that has purview over this data. Like, who could you even ask? You can't go asking, an institution that exists or an REB that exists at a certain university or hospital to look at this data that they have no purview over. So it's really problematic in that sense.
Yeah, and generally, you don't go to a judge asking for a ruling. You go to a judge usually with a suggestion around how you think you want to handle a problem. And that's the same with an REB. You generally don't ask them, do I need it? You should say, I think I don't because of these criteria. Do you agree or don't you agree? And that usually gives them what they need to either agree or disagree. And I've had both, but at least they understand the basis in which you're asking. It's good to have a suggestion, I think. The question was asked on the chat, what if the REB agrees with you, but you submit a paper to a journal and they say, no, we think this is research and therefore, we're not sure how to handle this. In that case, the editor is abusing their privilege, quite honestly. That shouldn't occur because they have no mandate as a journal editor to decide to overrule a research ethics board of a jurisdiction, nor can they possibly know the guiding rules for research ethics in any given jurisdiction. It's an international journal. So they really shouldn't be doing that. That's really the response. Sometimes it's said here, but should you just get it anyway because some people believe you need it to publish? Sometimes that's the case. And I've done that. Because usually it's also a very easy, quick REB approval anyway. So, there's no point in dying on the hill for it. no more thoughts, then Aaron, to you for authorship.
For those of us who are in Canada, the University of Alberta has created a new, or Alberta Health Services has created a tool online called ARECCI, ARECCI, I believe it is, if you could look it up there. Anyway, you can actually put your project protocol through that, a series of yes/no questions, and it'll tell you what the algorithm decides what it thinks the risk is to subjects, and therefore suggests, no, you don't need REB approval, or you go ahead and it says, yes, you should submit this to an REB. Now, I haven't been gutsy enough yet to put some of my smaller projects through that, take the waiver, and then put that in a paper saying we had an REB exemption from the ARECCI website. I haven't been that gutsy yet, but you know what I'm getting at, right? Like it is a easy, free online screening tool to use if you have some ambiguity around whether or not your project might need an REB, whether it's research or quality improvement or educational or something. So I can post the link to the group if they're interested in that. Oh, Catherine, you did. Great, thanks. Yeah, so it's easy to use. It's very easy to use. It's just, is the final answer good enough for a journal or for some other authoritative body to say, yep, go ahead and publish it? I don't know that answer.
Yeah, great resource.